I'm going to collect the papers from you at the end of class, all right? So does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask before I begin? All right. You might recall that the point at which I'd ended was I had been discussing with you the whole incident in Ayodhya, the Ram Janambhoomi movement. And I had sort of talked to you about communalism and Hindu-Muslim relations. And let me tell you what the agenda is for today and indeed for this week, so that you can sort of, do the readings accordingly and think about some of these subjects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about Hindu-Muslim relations in India today, in contemporary South Asia. And then in the second half of my lecture today, I'm going to move towards, if you look at the syllabus, you'll see that the topic under discussion is conflicts over religion, ethnicity, and language, and of course over class in India today. And one of the principal forms in which conflicts take place is caste violence. So I'm going to talk about that this week, but essentially this week's lectures are in continuation of what we did last week, because what we're doing is we're essentially, there we were looking at religious conflict, essentially between Hindus and Muslims. So I'm going to continue that discussion, and then in the second half of my talk today, I'm going to look at the demand for a separate Sikh state, or if you want to put it in other words, I'm going to look at the Sikh separatist movement in India. In order to appreciate some of the nuances of that, you're not going to be able to get all of them in 30-45 minutes, particularly since you don't really have a background in Indian history. But to get to some of the nuances, I'm going to have to go over some early periods of Indian history with you, including the beginnings of Sikhism, because I'm sure that the bulk of you in this class have no idea what Sikhism is and what kind of religion that is. And then in my lecture on Thursday, I'm going to look briefly, and this is where South Asia does come into play here. I'm going to look briefly at Sri Lanka, the conflict that has been taking place in Sri Lanka, which I had spoken to you about earlier. I think I'd spent about 5 minutes in one of my previous lectures. I want to spend a little bit more time. If you've been reading the New York Times, which is a newspaper that I've recommended to you on previous occasions in this class as one source that you can, sort of go to keep up with the news, you would have noticed that the conflict has now reached a very critical stage in Sri Lanka. So in order to really understand this conflict, we were going to have to look at some of the issues that came up over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades in Sri Lanka. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to turn in my lecture on Thursday, and the bulk of the lecture on Thursday will be on caste violence, on particularly, the violence directed against Dalits, that is, the people who are considered to be the lowest of the low, if I may put it this way, in Indian society. And I think that some of you will come to the realization, if you don't, in any case, I'm going to spell it out for you, but some of you are going to come to the realization that there is an argument, which is, in my view, a somewhat compelling argument, and that argument is that violence against Dalits and violence against Muslims, for example, insofar as it's coming from Hindus, is really the same kind of phenomenon, because when you direct the violence against Muslims, you direct it against an external other. In some ways, when you direct it against lower caste people, you direct it against an internal other, if I may put it this way, right? Okay, so we're going to have to see whether, in fact, violence against Muslims or violence against other religious groups is not some kind of displaced violence. That is, it's being displaced onto them, because the real subject here is the nature of relationships within Indian society, and particularly within Hindu society. Okay, so that would be an argument that you'll have to consider, and again, you'll have to weigh the evidence yourself. So let me continue with Hindu-Muslim relations, and before I do that, I want you to look at this side of the board at these 5 terms. Some of these terms we've obviously talked about. We talked at considerable length about communalism, and we talked about its purported opposite, namely secularism. And you remember that one of the things I pointed out, that yes, there is a fundamental difference between the communalists and the secularists. For example, with respect to how they've looked at the whole issue of what happened in Ayodhya at the Babri Masjid, right? Because the secularist critique was that, well, that there is no justification for bringing down this mosque. This is a distortion of religion. And of course, there is a fundamental point to be made that where does one stop with this kind of thing? I mean, if you say that, well, the mosque was built at a site where there used to be a temple, or in fact it is built with some of the remains of the temple, well, there are probably thousands of such monuments in India which have been built with the remains of what was formerly either a church or a mosque or a temple, depending on who's building it, right? This is what's called spoliage, as I mentioned to you. So where do you stop? Should all of these monuments be brought down? Right? And in fact, actually, the VHP, remember that I'd given you a breakdown of the Hindu right movement and given you the names of these organizations. So the VHP is the organization that does the cultural work of the Hindu right. Well, the VHP has issued a list of 3,000 mosques that they claim ought to be all removed. 3,000. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because you're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of mosques. And I think it's a safe bet that a good number of them have been built with some of the rubble of Hindu temples. But that doesn't mean that Hindu temples were destroyed by the Muslims. I mean, some temples get, if I may put it this way, over a period of time, temples fall apart, buildings fall apart, right? And we know that this same thing happened with the Hindus and the Jains to some degree, as I pointed out to you, right? Okay, so where would you draw the line? Where would you stop? And is it possible to have reparations of this kind? Because what is a demand? In a way, it's a kind of a demand for reparations. Okay, so I'm suggesting to you that yes, there is a fundamental difference between the communalist outlook and the secular outlook. But I had also pointed out to you that there's some things that are common, in fact, between the communalist view and the secularist view. And one of the things that is common is the recourse to history. That both sides are saying, we have, in brief, the better history. We have the better historical narrative about what actually happened in the 15th century. Okay? Now, we need to spell out secularism a little bit more. Because what I have left unsaid, and this is something that is absolutely critical for you to understand, is that the Indian meaning of secularism is not identical to what you will understand by secularism in the West today. Okay, so if I ask somebody here, what is secularism? And if somebody replied, you would say, well, secularism means the separation of church and state. Okay, it means that you draw a line between the realm of belief and the realm of the state, if I may put it this way. Okay, so render unto God what is God's and render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, if I may put it this way. Okay, right? And when did secularism come into place? Well, we know that, at least according to the official narrative, in the late 18th century, particularly with things like the French Revolution. Okay, the secularist outlook becomes predominant. And the secularist outlook insists that you cannot bring religion into the public domain. Okay, so that's a separation of church and state. And whether, in fact, you ever have this separation completely is another question. Because I, for example, do not hold to the view that the US is a completely secular state. But that's a separate matter. Okay, we can dispute about whether, in fact, any country is as secular as it claims to be. Right? But that is the official view of what constitutes secularism. In India, you have that view, but you have a variant of that view. A variant of that view. At the same time, in fact, it's a more important conception of secularism in the Indian context. In the Indian context, secularism means not that the state shall not necessarily interfere in the domain of religion, but that if it interferes, it shall not do so to privilege one religion over another. Okay, so let me translate this for you in very simple terms. The hardcore secular view, which is the view that you may get over here, this is what constitutes secularism. The hardcore view is, so let's take an illustration, that the state will not fund public education if that public education is teaching a particular religious ideology. Okay, it cannot fund a church-educated, church-run school. Okay, or a school run by Muslims. The state shall not do that. The secular view is not saying, by the way, that there shall be no church-run schools, but that if there are going to be church-run schools, they have to be funded by the church. The state cannot interfere in that, okay? Right? And similarly, if there are going to be schools funded by the Muslim community or the Hindu community, well, let the Muslim community or the Hindu community do it, but there can be no state funds. The Indian view is, okay, the state can actually do that. It can fund a church-run school, but then it must ensure that it gives the same amount of money to the Muslim community and to the Hindu community and to the Buddhist community or whichever community makes that particular demand. Okay? So in other words, it's not that the state shall not interfere in matters of religion. It may interfere in matters of religion, but it shall not privilege one religion over another in the public domain. Okay? So that's the Indian variant that you'll have to keep in mind. Now, very often when people talk about Hindu extremism or Muslim extremism, they use the word fundamentalism. And I want to tell you that I think that particularly in the case of Hindu extremism, that term is not a very intelligent term to use. Okay? It's not really intelligible either. And the reason it isn't is because fundamentalism has its origins in Protestant Christianity. Okay, it begins in the late 19th century, early 20th century in the United States. So when you hear the phrase, which you hear all the time, Christian fundamentalism, well, that is a phenomenon, because what Christian fundamentalism actually refers to is the teachings of the fundamentalists who basically insist upon a literal reading of the Bible. Okay, and of course it means going back to the fundamentals through the literal reading of the Bible. Now, there is no such demand among the Hindu extremists. Okay? This is a typical problem in the interpretation of history and society, particularly when you're using the template of Western history and then trying to understand Indian history through that. And of course, the idea is not to say that Hindu extremism is less dangerous than something called Hindu fundamentalism. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm simply trying to suggest that we have to be very careful how we understand these phenomena, because if you say Hindu fundamentalism, then the person who's using that idea is thinking really of Christian fundamentalism as the template, okay, as the model, and then you basically plug that model into any other community, such as a Hindu community, Muslim community, Buddhist community, so forth and so on. What you do have is Hindu extremism, but that's not the same as Hindu fundamentalism, which in my view does not really exist. Okay? And then nationalism here, a term we haven't looked at, and we have to really look at it in relationship to false consciousness, because we have to try to understand what the Marxist view of communalism is. The Marxist view of communalism in India is that it is essentially a form of what they call false consciousness. Okay? I mean, that's a plain old-fashioned Marxist terminology. What does that mean? What it means very, very simply, and the minute I give the idea to you, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The Marxist view is that communalism is nationalism gone in the wrong direction. Because what is nationalism? Nationalism is the feeling of patriotism, the feeling, so during the colonial rule, a nationalist wanted to get the British out of India. Okay? So the Marxist view, Marxist is looking at the situation, is looking at, for example, why is it that Hindu communalism becomes so important, as I pointed out to you, in the 1920s, 1930s. Right? Incidents of Hindu-Muslim riots began to multiply in the 1920s, 1930s. Right? So the Marxist is saying to himself or herself, hey, why are these Hindus engaging in Hindu communalism? Because instead of opposing the Muslim, they should be opposing the British. The British is our common enemy. Right? That would be the nationalist view, that you oppose the British because they're obviously opposed to the national advancement of India, national interests of India, so forth and so on. They're exploiting us. But instead, the Hindus and the Muslims are fighting each other. Right? And so what the Marxist is saying is that communalism is really a form of nationalism that has been completely distorted. It's gone off the rail tracks, if I may put it this way. Okay? Because this is the false consciousness of the communalist. The communalist has a split consciousness. One part of him understands that you should really be opposing the British, but the false consciousness takes over, and in this false consciousness, the Hindu communalist or the Muslim communalist, the same phenomenon is occurring over there, begins to view the other as the enemy and forgets about the British. Okay, that's essentially what false consciousness means. And I'm saying to you that if you look in the historiography, this is one of the things that you're going to have to understand. What is a particular relationship between all of these terms, communalism, secularism, and nationalism? Yes, Natalie. The false consciousness is essentially a consciousness, okay, whereby you, in a sense, forget what your real interests are. If you are a working class person, okay, and you feel that you're being exploited, you should be really opposing your oppressor. The oppressor is the upper class person, right? Instead, you begin to oppose the Muslim lower class person, right? Or if you're a Muslim, you begin to oppose the Hindu lower class working person, right? Because you forget that the real nature of oppression has to do with class, right? Rather than having to do with religion, right? So false consciousness basically is an argument. The Marxist argument is that this religion is where the, if I may put it this way, the energies of these communalists have been directed. But they are grossly mistaken in this, because essentially what these people have to be done is they have to be brought around to the recognition of what is the true condition of their liberation. So false consciousness prevents you from understanding what is a true condition of your oppression, and therefore the true condition of your liberation. Yeah.
Is this definition of nationalism and false consciousness defined by the Muslims and the Hindus, or is it defined by the exploitation of the British taking advantage of the differences?
The false consciousness is an idea generated by Marxist ideology. Marxist thinkers are thinking, okay, you're trying to understand why is it. Let's take India, 1920s, okay? So you've got conflicts over caste, over class. You also have conflicts over, if I may put it this way, the national interest. That is that there is a nationalist movement. The nationalist movement is opposed to the British and saying that the British have to leave India, okay? But at the same time that this is occurring, that the nationalist movement is occurring, you also have ferocious fighting going on between the Hindus and the Muslims, right? So the Marxist is trying to understand, why are Hindus and Muslims fighting each other? Why are they not together, coming together to fight their real oppressor, the British, right? And why is this not occurring? Because according to the Marxist view, the Hindus and the Muslims who are fighting each other are inflicted by false consciousness. That is that they forget the true nature of their oppression. They forget who their real oppressor is. Their real oppressor is the British, or let's say if you were a Hindu-Muslim, conflict here, it could also, your true oppressor could be, for example, a person who's a upper caste Brahmin. Okay, instead you're fighting the Muslim, you should be really fighting the upper caste Brahmin. If you're a lower caste Hindu, that's your true oppressor. Okay, that's essentially the argument here. Okay, yeah.
My question though about that, I understand that I guess I'm confused about where the false consciousness is coming from. Is it through the British, imperialism?
Who's generating it?
Exactly.
But that could have to do with the kind of history that you've grown up with, the kinds of teachings that you have inherited from your society. Your question is a very good one. That is that how do you, because the flip side of that question is, if somebody is suffering from false consciousness, how do you, in a way, reform them? How do you get them out of that, right? That could be the task of revolutionaries, it could be the task of teachers, it could be the task of pedagogy, it could have to do with how your history textbooks are being written, right? All these kinds of things. Yeah, okay? And explicitly in the question that you're asking, it would have to do with the fact that a certain British construction of Indian history, okay, gets accepted by the Indians themselves. And this British construction of Indian history has to do with the sorts of things I was talking about last time, namely that essentially they're constructing an Indian past where the Hindus and Muslims have always been fighting each other, right? And you remember that what I had suggested to you was that in fact there is an Indo-Islamic synthesis that takes place in Indian culture. Okay, so that would be, I mean, if you had to sort of give a very precise answer to the question, which is I think more or less the sort of thing that you're asking, that would be the answer, namely that yes, according to certainly the Marxist view and the Indian nationalist view, British historiography had a great deal to do with how we in India understand our own past. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any questions about this over here? Now, let me give you an illustration of how this matter becomes a little complex. I want you to take a look at two Indian cities, because we are on the subject of Hindu-Muslim relations. And we're trying to understand why is it that in some situations Hindus and Muslims might enter into conflict with each other, and in some situations they may not. Right? And of course you could say, somebody could say hypothetically, oh well, but the situations could be vastly different. For example, if we took a city where the Muslims constituted only 5% of the population, right? Maybe the Hindus do not feel threatened by them over there. And maybe there's less rioting there, less violence over there. But if we took a city where, let's say, this is all purely hypothetical, right? A city which had a 35% population of Muslims, you might say that, well, conflict is more likely in that city, okay? Because the Hindus might feel more threatened. It's a kind of argument that you might hear, for example, that, oh, well, you know, somebody else is taking our jobs, that kind of thing, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at two cities which are actually quite identical with each other, right? Because then we can't make this argument that, oh, these cities are vastly different, you know, in terms of their composition of population, so forth and so on. So if you look at Calicut, which is a city in Kerala, a state that I've mentioned to you on numerous occasions, right? The Muslim population of Calicut is about 36 to 37%. And if you look at Aligarh, which is a town in UP, and again Uttar Pradesh, a state that I've talked to you about quite often as well, the Muslim population there is about 35%. I don't think you can get much closer in terms of composition of population, right? 35, 36% roughly, right? And in fact, it may be virtually identical, given that there could be obviously some, you know, errors in the census, right? Both of these cities or towns have a population of slightly less than 1 million. That's important too, because if we took Delhi, we said, ah, that's a population of 15 million, so the dynamics of a huge metro are going to be very different. Now here we're talking about two cities that have roughly the same distribution of Muslims. Both of them are roughly the same size, and you cannot find two cities in India which have such a different history of violence. Aligarh has been rocked by violence for the last 60 years. Constant conflicts between the Hindus and the Muslims, okay? Episodes, and when I say conflict here, it's not simply a conflict waged over the internet today or in newspapers, okay? I'm talking about violence. I'm talking about violence which leaves scores of people dead on certain occasions. On the other hand, Calicut has not had a single Hindu-Muslim riot in the last 100 years, okay? Now that's an interesting problem. It's an interesting problem because you have to say, well, why is it that Calicut has not had, okay, any kind of political violence of this kind, and why is it that Aligarh displays a very different history, right? And again, I'm going to have to give you a very, very capsule condensed account of this, because obviously if we started doing a very detailed history of these two cities, you know, we can add more and more nuances to the argument. But this is the basic complication that we're looking at here. We're saying, do Hindu-Muslim relations always lead to conflict, or are there situations where clearly they do not lead to conflict? In fact, they lead to not simply harmony, but they lead to an understanding that each community or each person is absolutely indispensable to the other, okay, for the working together of that town, right? That's the question that we're really looking at over here. Okay, now let me add a few more things. So, and by the way, this is this comparison I'm looking at is, you know, I'm drawing the data here from a study that's been done by an Indian political scientist who had been, you know, working over this question for many years, for over a decade. That is, you know, how does one understand Hindu-Muslim relations? And he actually looks at several other pairs of this kind to try to understand. So he looks at Lucknow and Hyderabad, two very famous Indian cities. Hyderabad, again, city in South India. These are bigger cities now, right? But again, you get roughly the same. So Hyderabad is roughly over here in Andhra Pradesh, and you've had a long history of communal violence. Lucknow is not very far from Aligarh. It's less than 100 kilometers from Aligarh, and Lucknow has not really had much of a history of communal violence. Okay, so you know, there are other pairs of this kind that we can look at, but let's look at this Aligarh and Calicut a little bit more closely. So his argument essentially is this. Let me tell you what his argument is. I think to some degree it's persuasive. I think there are some other complications that we may have to throw into the picture later on. his argument is that in a place like Calicut, you have various civic associations and networks that work together to contain the possibility of violence. The problem with Aligarh is you don't have such networks. You do not have a history of civic associations. And when I say civic associations, it can mean all kinds of things. It can mean, clubs, friendship societies. It could mean, various social gatherings and organizations, okay, where Hindus and Muslims partake of each other's company. Right? He's saying that essentially Calicut has a large network of such organizations which have worked for a long time to prevent any incidents of communal violence. Aligarh does not. Of course, that begs the question, why does Calicut have them and Aligarh do not? And you could say, well, it may simply have to do with how people are in one city as opposed to another. Okay? And that would not be particularly persuasive in my view, because then it would say that, well, some people are just more prone to violence in particular places, and in other places they're less prone to violence. Right? And if we say that, then it seems to me that we should stop doing social science or history or whatever it is, because we say, well, we can't really do very much about it because that's just how people are in one place as opposed to another. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So you're saying that anti-consciousness, I guess, comes from organizations. So would you say that consciousness comes?
Well, okay, your question is, how does one relate this essentially to the sort of the paradigm that has been laid over here before? Namely that, does this have to do with, could one say that the people of Aligarh who engage in such forms of violence are more inflected by false consciousness, right? I mean, essentially, in a nutshell, I don't know if I would want to put it that way, because in describing this to you here, by the way, you would have noticed very carefully, I didn't say that I necessarily agree with this Marxist view of false consciousness. I think it's kind of a simple, primitive view, if I may put it this way, right? I mean, I think there's something to it, because there's something, I think, to most interpretations, but I'm not entirely certain of this argument over here. So whether one would want to use this template of false consciousness and say, well, the people in Aligarh, are more inflected by false consciousness, but that would still beg the question, why are they more infected by it than the people in Calicut? Okay? Is there something in the social or cultural history of a region which might be somewhat decisive, okay, in being able to tell us why it's put down, violence is put down in one place and not put down in another, or why violence breaks out in one place to begin with rather than in another place, right? And you could say, I mean, there is, of course, in Indian historiography, there is one simple explanation that has been given for why there's a difference here, right? Anybody?
Is it because Aligarh is so concentrated in the north, that that's where the capital, it's closer to the capital, it's where most of...
No, not really. No, it's not. I mean, it's relatively close to the capital, yes, but then you'd have to say why more violence takes place.
The British were in the northern area more than they were.
Oh, but the capital of India shifted to Delhi only in the 20th century. I mean, the capital of British India used to be Calcutta. Okay, so then we're saying that, the shifting of the capital had something to do with it. Not really, no. Because you would also then have to say why, you see, and that's why Lucknow, which is not, as I said, terribly far away, I mean, it's within the same North Indian domain, Lucknow has not really had, and it has a very significant population of Muslims and Hindus both, but Lucknow has not had a history of communal violence, right? So we'd have to be able to explain why Lucknow has not had it, why Aligarh has it. Yeah.
Does that do with religious sites?
It may, but you remember that Kerala, I've always said something about Kerala a number of times. I mean, I'm just saying, what is the explanation most people have given? Education, okay, one thing. But then we would have to be able to demonstrate that being educated means you're less communalist, okay? And in fact, the problem is that all studies have shown that the educated in India are more communal minded than people who are not educated. In fact, violence of this kind, communal violence, is a distinctly urban phenomenon. I want you to really think about that one. Distinctly urban phenomenon.
I mean, some studies claim, and I think they're largely right, that well over 90% of all incidents of communal violence, that is violence between members of different religious communities, in India, in the post-1947 period, well over 90% of these incidents have taken place in large urban areas, not in villages in the countryside, okay, where rates of literacy would be much lower. Okay. Now, I'm not saying you're incorrect. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we'd have to then view this matter with some amount of subtlety. There could be complications, and because I think your intuition here may be right. Your intuition says to you, well, if people are more educated, then they're less likely to. But I'm not so sure about that. You see, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the 19 out of the 20 people who bombed the World Trade Center on 9/11 were highly educated. 19 out of 20. They were not your poor people from the Muslim world. Okay, right? So I think that education is a complicated matter. Somebody else had their hand up over here. What is it? Yeah. Okay, so why is the distribution of wealth in Kerala different? I mean, nobody said that one word. What kind of political regime have we had? Communist. Communism, right? Now, I'm not saying that that's my explanation. Okay, you're probably wondering what is my explanation, you know, because I keep on telling you, well, but this is an argument that's been made, namely that what accounts for this difference is the communists have reined in this violence. Okay, they have made sure that violence doesn't break out in Calicut. And I think there's something to that as well. No question about it, you know. Okay, that the communists have been much more effective in it. The problem there, of course, has to do with then extrapolating from there and saying, well, communist ideology is much more likely to prevent violence. I don't buy that even an iota. And even an iota, because some of the most violent regimes of the 20th century, including Stalinist Russia, have been communist. Okay, right? So we've got a little bit problem there as well. Yeah.
I have a question. So
yeah.
basically, you said in both these cities, the Muslim population is the same. Right?
The same.
But is the Hindu population the same as well? I mean, in Kerala, would there be like a...
Well, you've got Christians too. Yeah, you've got Christians too. You've got Christians too, but you know, that may be an interesting complication. You could say that, well, actually, look, the Hindu population in Aligarh and in Calicut is different because about 20% of the population in Calicut would be Christian as well. You could say that, okay? But nonetheless, we're saying Hindus are still the dominant group numerically, okay? And we're also saying that if you look at Aligarh and if you look at Calicut, the Muslim population is not only virtually identical, okay, but you're talking about cities or towns of roughly the same size, okay? So, you know, then you don't get into economies of scale here, because as I said, if you get into a city that's very, very large, well, there are different economies of scale that work over there, okay? So, you know, whether the Christian influence there, I think the way to phrase that question, because your intuition here is absolutely right in my view, namely that, look, maybe there's a presence of another element which might help explain. And in part it may have to do with the fact that when you think that there is a slightly more even distribution of the groups, right, no one group can exercise hegemony or dominance, okay? That's a possible reading. I would agree with that, okay? And with respect to the question of education, maybe a slightly better way of putting it, that is a more detailed view of putting it, we could say, okay, let's try to figure out what percentage of the population here is not simply educated, okay, which is misleading in the Indian context, but for example, what percentage of the population reads newspapers? Why? Because, or has the news read to them? You know that for every one newspaper in India, unlike here, so here if you have a newspaper, it means it's being read by one person except the newspaper that goes to a public library, okay? Now in India that's absolutely not the case. One newspaper is going to be read by a minimum of 10 people. And in the village, it's 100 people are listening to it, because in the barber shop or under the tree where the barber is sitting, somebody is reading out the newspaper and 50 people are listening to what he's saying. Okay, right? So, you know, this means that how we understand education, literacy, your access to news, all of these things have to be understood in a slightly different way. But let me give you some figures here, okay, just for your consideration, right? So what percentage of Hindus and Muslims eat together? Now you might say, well, why is that important? Of course it's important, right? Who you decide to share your dinner table with is important, right? And particularly if you're looking at Hindu society, you're going to hear a lot more about that when we get to the founding of Sikhism. I mean, one of the reasons why the Sikh religion became very popular for a point in time in the Punjab, gained a lot of adherents, if I may put it this way, was because it did not have any kind of prohibition or taboo on commensality. Commensality is eating together. Okay? Anthropologists use this a lot to try to figure out what are social relations between different groups. Who you eat with is very important. And one of the things we have found out, what this social scientist found out, was in Calicut, the 83% of the Hindus and Muslims that he spoke to described themselves as eating frequently with members of the other group. In Aligarh, it was 54%, substantially lower. In fact, I was surprised that it was that high, 54%. I have a feeling that among the 54% are people who probably eat with members of the other community once a year at most. Okay, and so they're saying, well, we do eat with members of the other community. 1% of Hindu and Muslim children play together. In Calicut, 90%. Okay, in Aligarh, 42%. Okay, a substantial difference, right? And what are these differences pointing to? The fact that obviously Hindus and Muslims have much closer relations, okay, than they do in Calicut than they do in Aligarh. And so this is the argument Ashutosh Varshney, who's looked at these two cities, is really trying to suggest, that where you have much closer links between the two communities, whether formal or informal, where you have a history of civic associations, these associations will come together, okay, to prevent the incidence of communal violence. And I think that if you look at it from a common sense point of view, at least, it seems to me absolutely right. Right? As I said, the problem here simply has to do with understanding why is it that in one city these groups do come together, and this is where we get into the social history of Calicut, the social history of Aligarh. Okay? And the social history has to do, in the case of Kerala, it has to do A, with communism. Okay, so the communists imposed a kind of a rigorous ideology, equal land, massive campaign of land redistribution, which meant that whether you were Hindu or a Muslim or Christian, everybody was entitled to some land. Okay, so you have a society that is more given to equality. Okay, and you could say that higher levels of education may have something to do with it. It also has to do with the fact that from the 19th century onwards, okay, in this part of the country, there was a concerted attempt to improve literacy levels from the very beginning. So reading clubs in Kerala, in places like Calicut, from the early 1900s, you have the development of reading clubs. Okay? And reading clubs can be viewed as a form of a public space, like a public library. Okay? This did not happen in Aligarh. In fact, in Aligarh, what you do have is an opposite phenomenon, if I may put it this way. Not exactly opposite phenomenon. Aligarh is the place where a university gets founded called the Aligarh Muslim University. I'm giving you the name by which it is known now. Originally, when it was founded, it was not known by that name, but that's the name that it eventually acquired. Now, the significance of Aligarh Muslim University is that the leading agitators or theorists or politicians who demanded a separate state of Pakistan were largely educated at this university. Now you can begin to see what's happening here, right? They're educated largely at this university, and one of the things that happens after partition, okay, is the Muslim population of Aligarh is going to diminish considerably. The Muslim population of Aligarh before independence was 46%. 46%, so roughly half of the entire population of the city, right? And now it's down to, as I said, a third, 35, 36%. Okay, so you have a considerable exodus of Muslim elites. The most well-educated Muslims of Aligarh all left. They left for Pakistan. But there was also a resentment among the Hindu population that the demand for Pakistan had come from Aligarh Muslim University. Okay? And so some part of the explanation would have to do with the social history of these two cities. And we are saying that if some part of the explanation comes from the social history of these two cities, then we are saying that it is also conceivable that Hindu-Muslim relations in these two cities, especially in Aligarh, could change dramatically if the social history of this city in the future changes. Right? There is nothing irreversible about this at all. And one of the very interesting arguments that I made, and this is going to be my point of transition to the next segment now, okay, one of the very interesting arguments that's been made is that Hindu-Muslim relations have been somewhat less prone to violence in Aligarh in very recent years. Why? Because conflict within the Hindu community has grown enormously. Okay? So now, of course, that's unsettling. I mean, it's interesting but unsettling, because you certainly don't want to eliminate one conflict by starting another conflict, if I may put it this way. Okay? Right? But this is an argument that's been made by the author of this study, because he's trying to show that when, for example, lower caste consciousness in Aligarh is growing, so the lower castes are now rebelling against the upper castes, against Brahmins. Some of that violence is now being directed at the Brahmins, not at the Muslims. Okay? But then, of course, as I said, this raises the difficult question for us: how does one, in fact, actually resolve the conflict, the question of conflict, and what is the relationship between caste conflict, okay, and religious conflict? So that's something that we're going to save until Thursday, when I get into the question of caste violence in India. All right, let me turn to the question of Hindu-Sikh relations now. Okay, and in order to do that, and when I say Hindu-Sikh relations here, I'm also going to be talking about the demand for a separatist, okay, the separatist demand for a state called Khalistan, right? And I have to say, by the way, that this demand by Sikh secessionists, let's just call them that for the sake of convenience. I certainly don't want to use the phrase Sikh terrorists, because this raises all kinds of implications, right? But secessionists, that is, that they're people who are demanding secession from the Indian Union. Okay. Now, this demand for Sikh secessionism should be understood really as a demand for Sikh autonomy, and that demand really takes two different forms. Okay, the people who are divided. One demand is a demand for greater autonomy within India. Okay, which would mean that if you were making a demand for autonomy within a greater India, would mean that the central government should interfere less in the affairs of the state. You leave most matters to the state government. Okay, and this goes back to the whole question of federalism that we had talked about, center-state relations, right? The other demand is a demand that a separate nation state should be carved out for the Sikh population. Okay, and this, yes. Yeah, we're not assessing whether the demand is realistic or probable or not, right? We're simply saying this was the demand, and we have to understand why there was a demand and what was the nature of the conflict that took place, right? Okay, now in order to understand that, let us for a moment, very, very quickly, I mean, this is a really capsule history that you're going to get. Look at what is this religion called Sikhism, and what is its particular relationship to both Islam, okay, and Hinduism, right? And you should recall that in the 15th century, for those of you who remember, again, the very short history that I gave you in order to understand Hindu-Muslim relations, in the 15th century, North India was certainly under Muslim rule. Okay, you remember I've spoken to you about these dynasties called the Delhi Sultanate dynasties, and then in the 16th century, in 1526, the Emperor Babur is going to lay the foundations for the Mughal Empire. Okay, so the Babri Masjid that I've spoken about is built during his time, right, at his command. Okay, several decades before Babur comes along in 1526, in the 1520s, you have a man born in North India, in the Punjab today, by the name of Guru Nanak. Okay, guru, the word guru, by the way, means teacher. Of course, now it's entered into the English language. So you have things like management gurus and even sex gurus and all kinds of gurus. You know, anybody who can teach you about a particular subject is a guru, so to speak. Okay, the word guru has many registers, but essentially it means teacher. Okay, teacher. So Guru Nanak is going to be credited with founding a new faith called Sikhism. The word Sikhism, this word Sikh comes from Shishya, which means pupil, okay, student. Okay, and in the 15th century, as I've said, North India is under Muslim rule, and you already have, okay, obviously two communities that some people thought were sharply defined. I don't accept that argument, as I've already indicated to you before. I don't accept the view that there is a community of people called Muslims who are sharply defined as Muslims, and then there's a community of people called Hindus sharply defined as Hindus. But nonetheless, what is very clear is that practitioners of Islam and practitioners of different forms of Hinduism, such as Vaishnavism, Shaivism, all of that, okay, obviously adhere to very different religious practices and religious beliefs, such as, for example, what kind of food you eat. So if you're a Muslim, well, there's obviously a taboo on the consumption of pork. If you're a Hindu, there's a taboo on the consumption of beef. Okay? If you're a Muslim male, you're circumcised. If you're a Hindu male, you're not. Right? If you're a Hindu, according to this view, you are a polytheist. If you're a Muslim, you are a monotheist. Okay? And I'm not saying that I again necessarily accept these terms, because polytheism, monotheism, these are all terms taken from the Western understanding of these religions. Right? So we are using them for the sake of convenience, because we are saying, well, it's possible to identify a difference between practitioners called Hindus today and practitioners of something called Islam. Okay? So in the 15th century, when Guru Nanak comes around, you have great teachers such as Guru Nanak himself, and of course somebody called Kabir. And Kabir is basically going to, if I may put it this way, he's going to mock both the Muslims and the Hindus. He's going to say that both of them are fools. Okay? I mean, they're absolutely pretentious, the believers of both of these faiths. That's his view. Kabir, very, very famous poet. Okay? And so Kabir is going to try to preach, if I may put it this way, a different kind of universal faith. Because he's going to say, what's the real difference between a Hindu and a Muslim, right? What's the real difference? So one says the namaz, the other doesn't say the namaz. One reads the Quran, the other reads the Veda. Okay? But does religion have anything to do with reading the namaz or not, according to Kabir? Does it have anything to do with reading a particular text or not? Or is religion really, or belief, or faith, really a matter of human conduct, good conduct, right? So Kabir is going to, I mean, if I had these phrases, I would read them out to you. I mean, he's just going to launch into a scintillating attack on both the Muslims and the Hindus, particularly their leaders, particularly the Maulvis and the Pandits. Okay? Right? Now, it is in that climate that somebody like Guru Nanak is born. He comes around. Okay? And what does Guru Nanak try to do? He tries to create, I'm simplifying here considerably for the sake of argument, he's going to try to create a synthesis. Okay, he's going to try to create a religion, and some people say, well, he's not trying to create a religion at all. The religion is going to be founded later on. It's going to come about systematically, you know, through his teachings and through the people who are going to be following him, right? There are 10 gurus in the Sikh faith, 10 teachers in the Sikh faith. The last of them dies in 1708. His name is Guru Gobind Singh. Okay? That doesn't mean that the Sikh faith ends, not at all. What Guru Gobind Singh does before his death is he institutionalizes the Sikh faith, okay, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay, but this is the transition we're talking about from that Guru Nanak comes about in the 1460s, and then over the course of the next 2 or 3 decades, he's going to become an itinerant preacher. He's going to go around, okay, and he's going to start creating this new faith, and he's going to acquire new disciples. What is this new faith? It's a synthesis of Islam and Hinduism, if we want to put it that way. Okay? And that's the religion called Sikhism. Okay? And then, as I said, this religion is going to have 10 teachers. Now, the significant thing, the first significant thing in our narrative, okay, is that from the point of view of the early Sikhs, your main opponent was not the Hindu, it was the Muslim. Why? Because North India is under Muslim rule. The Mughal emperors, some of them, are going to say, oh, this is a new heretic faith. Its disciples need to be eliminated, or they need to be converted back to Islam. Or if they were original Hindus, they need to be converted to Islam. Right? So one of the gurus is going to be brought before the Mughal emperor. He's going to be asked to convert. Guru Tegh Bahadur. The guru is going to say, I refuse to do that. He's going to be martyred. So the history of martyrdom is very crucial to the history of Sikhism. Okay? And what is also equally important here, as I'm suggesting to you, is that in the early history of the Sikh faith, at least for the first 200, 250 years, okay, the other was the Muslim. The other was the Muslim. That was your external enemy. Okay? A number of the Sikh gurus are going to be martyred, as I said. Now let me tell you a little anecdote here. And that anecdote is going to be important for trying to understand the crucial point that I want to make later on. Because a crucial point I want to make, let me suggest it to you right now, and then we'll have to go back to the anecdote, is that I'm going to suggest to you that if you look at the Sikh separatist or secessionist movement, okay, which arises in the 1970s, okay, and is going to continue through the early 1990s, it's diminished now. Some would say completely disappeared. And why is it completely disappeared? State repression, that would be one way to put it, that the state simply put it down, forcibly put it down. Okay, right? But what is crucial in that period, I want to suggest to you, and this is the context in which you're going to have to interpret the anecdote later on, is number one, I'm saying to you that the conflict in many ways is not a conflict between Hindus and Sikhs. It's a conflict within the Sikh faith about the meaning of Sikhism. And so therefore, number two, what that means, if you accept the first hypothesis, is that this conflict is really a conflict between Orthodox Sikhs and moderate Sikhs, and it gets displaced onto the Hindus. Okay, so it becomes displaced as a Hindu-Sikh conflict, but in effect it is really a conflict between moderate Sikhs and Orthodox Sikhs or militant Sikhs about the meaning of Sikhism. Okay, and to understand this, we have to really go back now to the time of Guru Gobind Singh and shortly before his death. So what is it? We are talking about the early 1700s. Sikhism is in peril. It's a young religion. It's being repressed by the Muslim state in India or by Muslim rulers in North India. Okay, right? So Guru Gobind Singh, who is going to be designated as the last guru, in fact, he's going to designate him, he's going to say there are going to be no gurus after me. So in fact, actually in the Sikh faith, what you have is you have a book called the Granth Sahib. Okay, so the Granth Sahib is the holy book of the Sikhs. Okay, and it is usually called the Guru Granth Sahib because the book becomes the guru of the Sikhs. It stands in place of a live guru. Okay, that's why the book has to be venerated at all times, just as you would venerate the guru, the great teacher. Okay, so in the early 1700s, the religion is in peril, and what is happening? Many of the Sikhs are relapsing back into Hinduism. Because who are the Sikhs? These are people who have converted, right? They've converted from Hinduism. And by the way, what is true here is what is true of all of the conversions that have taken place in India. The vast majority of the conversions are from the lower caste Hindus. And the reason is obvious, because the lower caste Hindus are the ones who have the most reason to convert, right? You know, the repression is greater, your economic prospects in life are very marginal, right? Much more inducement to convert. Why would you convert if you're an upper caste Hindu, right? Yes, question. I think you had your hand up.
Basically, you said Sikhism is an intermingling of Islam and Hinduism.
Yeah.
So did people from Islam actually convert to Sikhism, or was it just lower caste Hindus?
No. These are people who it's not Muslims who are converting. It's the faith that we're talking about. We're saying that where are the disciples coming into? Where in Sikhism, where are they coming from? These are all lower caste Hindus. But the particular ideology of Sikhism is a mix of Hinduism and Islam. That's what we're saying. Yeah. Okay. They're not converting from Islam. No. Right? Because if they're converting from Islam, these are people who would originally have been Hindus, then they convert to Islam, then they convert to Sikhism. Why would they convert to Sikhism? Because, you know, or to Islam from Sikhism, or either way, vice versa, it could be both ways. Well, because both of these religions are somewhat monotheistic, so there's very little reason to convert from Sikhism to Islam or from Islam to Sikhism, either way. Okay, the conversions are taking place from lower caste Hindus into either of the two faiths, into Sikhism or into Islam, right? So we are saying that Guru Gobind Singh is looking at, he's the person who has inherited the successorship. He's the last of the Gurus. Okay? He's really worried about the future of the faith. And he's worried about the future of the faith because the faith is being repressed by the Muslim state. And most importantly, of course, related to point number 1 here, is many of the people who have converted into Sikhism, they are now converting back to Hinduism. Why are they converting back? Because the Hindus have protection under the Muslim state, according to this view, right? But the Sikhs don't. Okay, and why is it that the Sikhs don't? Because the Sikhs are competing with the Muslims for lower caste Hindus. Right? Both of them are monotheistic faiths. So the Muslim ruler does not have anything to fear from his Hindu subjects, but he has something to fear from his Sikh subjects. Why? Because the Sikhs also are a monotheistic faith. Right? So this is a logic that we're really talking about here. Okay? And what we're saying is that Guru Gobind Singh is really fearful. So this is where the anecdotes now comes into place. So Guru Gobind Singh summons a meeting of the Sikhs and says, I want to create a brotherhood of the Sikhs, a brotherhood. I want to create a core group, if I may put it this way, of Sikhs who will swear to follow the practices of their faith even if they have to sacrifice their life. Right? So if a Muslim ruler comes into your area and says, you know, you're going to convert, you're not going to go into hiding or you're going to convert back into Hinduism. You're going to stand up for your faith. I want to create this brotherhood. And what that means is you have to be prepared to lay your life down for me because I am the Guru and for the Sikh faith. So he brandishes this huge sword, okay, and says, I want one person to come here in front of me and I'm going to chop his head off. That will show me that you are willing to give your life for the faith, that you are a person of courage. And of course, you know, there's this huge audience and, you know, there's a great deal of trepidation, right? Nobody really wants to come forward. And then he keeps on exhorting the people saying, what kind of cowards are you? If none of you is willing to lay down your life for me, for the Guru, for me, who is the teacher, right? How are you going to fight the Muslims, right? Right? So he does this constant exhortation. Finally, a man comes forward. And there's this little tent, enclosed space in there. So the Guru says, walk into the tent with me. He walks into the tent. Everybody out there hears this sound, a thud, you know, something falling. And the Guru comes out with his sword dripping with blood. And you all would reach the same conclusion that all the 10,000 people in that audience there had reached, namely that this man had been decapitated. His head had been chopped off. Right? So the Guru says, I want 5 such followers. Okay? So they're going to be called in the Sikh faith the 5 beloved. That's the phrase that's going to be used for them. Now, getting the second volunteer is even more difficult. Because if there was any doubt about what was going to happen to you, that doubt had been eliminated. Okay? So he's constantly exhorting them, so forth and so on. Finally, a second person comes forward. A male comes forward again. And then again, the Guru takes him into this tent. You hear this thud. He comes out. The sword is dripping with blood again. Then he wipes the sword again, asks for a third person, finally gets a third, finally gets a fourth, finally gets a 5th follower, walks into the tent with him, walks out a few minutes later with all the 5 and 5 goats that have been decapitated. Okay? 5 goats that have been decapitated. These are going to be the 5 beloved because he's saying, now we have created a brotherhood. He's going to call it the Khalsa. Okay? These are the true Sikhs. Now, how do you identify a true Sikh? Okay? From a Hindu, number 1. How do you distinguish a true Sikh from a Hindu? What are the outward signs? Okay? You could say, what are the outward signs for distinguishing, by the way, a Muslim from a Hindu? If somebody said a beard, well, not really, because a lot of Hindu intellectuals sport a beard. I have a beard. I'm not a Muslim, right? You could say, well, there's a, you know, the Muslim males wears, particularly during namaz, a little cap, you know, sort of like a skull cap. Okay, the Hindu doesn't, right? They're outward signs for distinguishing a Hindu. The upper caste Hindu wears a thread, traditionally. Okay, the Muslim does not. The thread is a caste sign. Okay, all right, so forth and so on. You could say that these are the marks. But how do you distinguish a Sikh from a Hindu. And by the way, have you noticed one interesting little point? If you think about it, that virtually all the marks of separation, okay, except the veiling of women, except that in Islam, all the marks of separation refer to men, not to women. Right? How do you distinguish a Sikh male from a Hindu male today? So you say, the Sikh male wears a turban. But what about Sikh women and Hindu women? How do you distinguish the two? You can't. Right? So it's very interesting. I mean, there's a problem of why is it that men become the insignia of the religion? Okay, that's a question that we're not going to tackle right now, but I just want to lay it for your consideration. Okay, so here we have a little problem. The problem here is, okay, Guru Gobind Singh says, all right, I've got the Khalsa. Khalsa is the pure, means the pure Sikhs. But I need to be able to identify all those who are going to be members of the Khalsa from those Sikhs who are not going to be members of the Khalsa. He's not saying that the other Sikhs are not going to be members of the Khalsa, but they have, if I may put it this way, a second-class status, if I may put it this way, within the Sikh faith, okay, according to the orthodox reading. So what he creates is what are called the 5 Ks. There are lots of fives going around here in the history of Sikhism. Okay, so Punjab is the land of 5 rivers. This is where the religion is prominent, right? The 5 beloved of the faith, the 5 Ks. Okay, so what are the 5 Ks? I'm not going to go over all of them, but these are 5 marks by which you identify a Sikh from a Hindu. Okay, or 5 marks, let me put it a different way, by which you identify a Khalsa Sikh, an Orthodox Sikh, from a non-Khalsa or non-Orthodox Sikh. Okay, and so one of them is Kesh. Kesh means hair. A Sikh should, and again it refers to men here, a Sikh male should not cut his hair. So if some of you have wondered why Sikh males have a turban, well, the hair is rolled up inside that, right? You don't cut your hair. Kesh. Okay, and we're not going to again try to unravel the meaning of all of these here, because then we're going to have to really get into the theology of Sikhism. The point here is that this is one of the marks, okay, one of the other marks, and then by the way, there's something that goes with it. So it's a pair, and one of the other case is the kanga. Kanga is a comb. For those of you who know Hindi, you would recognize the word immediately, a comb, because if you have hair, you need something to keep the hair in place. Okay, in place, not to cut it, in place. It's the comb, right? So you might say, think of it this way. One represents disorder, because if you let hair grow and don't do anything with it, it's disordered. The kanga keeps the hair in shape. It's the dialectic of disorder and order. Okay, I mean, there's a real reason for all of these things here. The point is that the Sikh Guru Gobind Singh, lays down a new order and then creates the new symbols of the faith, right? And let me tell you, as a little footnote, that the mark by which you today recognize a Sikh male from all others, the turban, is not part of the 5 Ks. The turban comes in much later. It's instituted by the British Army in India. Okay, another very interesting illustration of where the British have a great deal to do with who gets to be known as a Sikh and who isn't. Okay, now, okay, this is not all that distance from the problem that we're really talking about, as I'm going to try to explain to you. Okay, the problem has to do with today, has to do with, okay, who is a Sikh? How do you define a Sikh? So in the 19th century, for example, the 1855 census, counted all the Sikhs of India as Hindus. All of the Sikhs are counted as Hindus. And I can tell you that the Constitution of India today, okay, in 2 different sections, one of them is the Directive Principles of State Policy, the other is Article 318 or something like that. In these 2 different sections of the Constitution, in one place the Constitution says that the Sikhs, the Buddhists, and the Jains are to be considered as Hindus. And in another part of the Constitution, it says that the Sikhs are completely separate. They have to be counted separately. The Buddhists have to be counted separately. The Jains have to be counted separately. Okay? Because here what we're saying is there has long been a feeling that if you look at Sikhs and you look at Buddhists and Jains, and here we're interested only in the Sikhs for the moment, okay, there is no substantial difference according to one line of thinking between them and the Hindus. Whatever the differences may have been in the 15th century, in the 16th century, okay, these differences, at least substantively speaking, are not significant. That is that, yes, you can identify a Sikh male as being separate from a Hindu male, but what happens when a Sikh male decides to cut his hair, which a great many of them do? In fact, there's a word for them. They're called Mona Sikhs. Okay? Okay? Mona here means a Sikh who has cut his hair. So does he stop being a Sikh because he cuts his hair? Right? And the larger question behind that is, what is the difference between a Sikh and a Hindu? So I'm saying that there's a fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem, which has been the angst of the community in some ways, is that the question of whether Hindus and Sikhs constitute a distinct religious communities, whether there is a firm boundary between the two, is a question that has not been resolved down to the present day. Okay, that's essentially what I'm really saying to you. This is a context you need in order to understand the discussion. Now let's go to the Sikh separatist movement. So keep all of this in mind, okay? And then you go to the Sikh separatist movement. So you remember that one of the things that happened in the partition of India, I mean, I mentioned it very briefly to you. So when the partition of India takes place, and here we are talking about the partition on this side, not on this side. Not the partition that takes place on the eastern frontier, because there's a partition there too, obviously. Yeah.
Will this tie into finishing up the 5?
No, I don't want to do that because it's going to take too long to get into all of that. You know, you can read about all of that on my website. You know, minus which I mentioned in the syllabus. I've got articles on all of these things. Okay. If you look at the partition over here on the western side, so the Punjab is where the partition takes place. Okay, and one of the things that happened in the Punjab, so these figures are roughly from my memory, so I may be a little bit mistaken about the exact figures, but roughly, in the undivided Punjab, that is that before Punjab was partitioned and, you know, some of it or the good part of it went to Pakistan, in the undivided Punjab, Sikhs constituted about 15% of the population. The Hindus constituted 30% of the population. The rest would have been Muslims. Okay? In the divided Punjab, that is after partition, after 1947, the Hindus are going to constitute something like 60% of the population, the Sikhs about 40%, something like that. Okay? And there are going to be, of course, no Muslims, because the Muslims have all gone, except a small number here or there, have all gone to Pakistan. Okay? Now, I want you to keep in mind another thing as well. And again, this is something that's mentioned in the literature quite often, and there are conflicting ways of interpreting it. It has been said very often that in the fighting that took place, in the killings that took place on the West, and the western side, that the Sikhs had a disproportionate role to play in the killings that took place. Not because they're more bloodthirsty than the Hindus, you know, but rather because the view here is that the Sikh male always thought of the Hindu as effeminate, that the Hindus could not protect themselves from the Muslim, and this was going to be the role of the Sikh to protect them, because ideologically the Sikh and the Hindu were much closer together than the Sikh and the Muslim. In fact, the Sikh and the Muslim were bitter enemies, according to this narrative. Remember, that's why I went over the whole history of Sikh martyrdom, etc., etc. Okay? Right? So this is the narrative that we have, that the Sikhs had a greater proportion. And so what we're saying is now we've brought in a different element here, which is that Sikh militant discourse is particularly sensitive to the question of gender. Okay? Sikh militant discourse sees itself as a bastion of masculinity in many ways. And Sikh militant discourse constructs the Hindu as an effeminate person. Okay, very much in the way in which the colonial state had done. Okay, so that's an element that I'm bringing into the discussion here as well. Okay? What is very clear is that after partition, when the Muslims got their state, the Sikhs said, we need a state as well. Okay? So there's a demand for what is called a Punjabi Suba. Okay? So we need a state as well. There is a demand for a Sikh state. But at that time, the State Reorganization Committee, remember the States Reorganization Committee, which had sort of recrafted the map of India, came to the conclusion that this demand could not be conceded, this demand was not justified. Okay? And this demand is going to resurface. It's going to resurface throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, and we can't go into that history, but from the 1970s onwards, that history is going to become important for us. Okay? Because in the 1970s, a number of considerations come into place, right? And one of them has to do with the nature of politics in India. So you remember that who's the prime minister in the 1970s for the most part? Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay? And you remember that one of the things that's happened in the 1970s is that politics has become a lot more fractured. That is, that the Congress party, which had been the dominant political party in the post-independence period, in the 1970s, their hegemony disappears, right? And in fact, from 1977 to 1980, for the first time, a non-Congress party was ruling the country, right? All of this is in the histories and texts that you have, right? So you have to keep that context in mind as well, okay? Now, the other thing you have to remember is the Punjab goes through a green revolution, which I talked to you about before at great length. Punjab goes through a green revolution. What does a green revolution do? Well, it increases production, for sure. But it creates a new class of extremely wealthy farmers, and correspondingly, it creates a new class of dispossessed people. Right? Right? You have increasing inequality in the Punjab. You've got big farmers who are able to consolidate their land and are able to productively utilize the Green Revolution. Because in order for the Green Revolution to work, one of the things you have to do is you have to mechanize farming. You have to consolidate farms. You have land farms, large land areas, okay? Because in order to have a Green Revolution, you need effective use of irrigation, right? And if you've got a very small farm, you're not really going to be able to do it. Fertilizers, seeds, tractors, mechanized farming. So what you have is you have a new class of farmers who are going to come into a lot of money, but you're also going to have people who are going to be dispossessed, right? So what is the context here? We're going to have to continue this in the next class, but what is the context? Increasing class inequality, political fractures, a continued contestation over who is a Muslim, who is a Hindu, and who is a Sikh. What is the real difference between the two? A question that has still not been resolved 400 years after, 500 years after the founding of the faith, right? This is the context for the emergence of what is going to become a militant movement. So we're going to look at that very briefly on Thursday.